Most people think that finding a mountain of silver would be the ultimate win for a nation, but for 16th century Spain, it was the beginning of a terminal illness. In 1545, the Spanish crown hit the biggest jackpot in human history at a place called Potosi, a mountain in modern-day Bolivia that was essentially a solid block of silver. They thought they had solved the problem of poverty forever, but they actually committed economic suicide. Money is only useful if it represents something you've produced, but Spain decided that producing things was for poor people. By the time the silver ran out, Spain had forgotten how to make a single pair of shoes or a loaf of bread without buying it from an outsider. This is a forensic look at how a superpower found the keys to the vault and used them to lock itself in a cage of permanent debt. When a lottery winner blows through $100 million in a weekend, we call it tragedy. But when a global empire does it over a century, we call it history. The Spanish crown did not understand that wealth is a flow, not a static pile of shiny rocks sitting in a basement. They viewed their new colonies as a bottomless checking account that required no deposits, only withdrawals to fund an increasingly bloated lifestyle. This mindset created a fundamental disconnect between the value of a coin and the effort required to earn it, which is the exact moment a society begins to rot from the inside out. Instead of using their windfall to build roads, schools, or better farming techniques, they spent it on gold-plated cathedrals and endless wars to prove they were the biggest players at the table. They were the ultimate trust fund kids of the Renaissance, convinced that the party would never end because the mountain in the New World was supposedly infinite. By the time they realized that UCA not eat silver and UCA not wear raw bullion, the infrastructure of their nation had already withered away into a useless husk. The silver did not make Spain rich. It just made them expensive, lazy, and eventually completely bankrupt. A mountain of money is just a mountain of dirt until you try to spend it, and Spain spent it with the reckless abandon of a man who thinks he has cheated death. Potosi was not just a mine. It was a biological and economic meat grinder that pumped out over 40,000 tons of silver, effectively becoming the central bank for a world that was not ready for that much liquidity. The Spanish crown treated this mountain like a global ATM, establishing a conveyor belt of galleons known as the Silver Fleet to move the loot across the Atlantic. This was not trade in any traditional sense, because nothing of value was being produced in exchange for this wealth. It was pure extraction, a one-way street of pillage that bypassed the Spanish people entirely. The silver landed in Seville, but it did not stay there to help the local baker or the blacksmith improve their craft. Instead, it was immediately diverted to pay for the king's massive standing armies and his obsession with dominating every corner of Europe. The scale of this wealth was so massive that it distorted the very fabric of global commerce, turning the Spanish economy into a passive spectator in its own story. Because the crown had a direct line to the source of the world as currency, they felt no need to develop a tax base or encourage local businesses to grow. They were essentially living off a predatory payday loan from the earth itself, ignoring the fact that every ounce of silver pulled from Potosi carried a hidden cost that would eventually come due. This massive influx of metal created an illusion of invincibility, a high that masked the fact that the Spanish state was becoming a parasitic entity that lived off the labor of the conquered rather than the ingenuity of its own citizens. The Silver Fleet was a lifeline, but it was also a noose, slowly tightening as the empire became addicted to a resource they did not have to work to maintain. Hard work is a habit that dies the moment you think you're too rich to sweat, and Spain's Silver Mountain killed the national work ethic with surgical precision. Imagine a local shoemaker in Madrid who has spent his life perfecting his craft, only to find that he can no longer compete because the market is flooded with cheap, high-quality imports from the Dutch or the English. Because Spain was awash in silver, the price of everything produced locally skyrocketed, making it far cheaper to simply buy goods from foreign merchants who actually knew how to run a factory. This created a toxic culture where manual labor and entrepreneurship were looked down upon as the desperate scramblings of the lower classes. The Spanish elite, the hidalgos, viewed themselves as being above this sordid world of trade, preferring to live as idle consumers who spent their silver on French silks and Flemish lace. This was not just a lifestyle choice. It was a systemic collapse of the nation's industrial DNA that left them unable to produce even the most basic necessities. While the rest of Europe was going through a proto-industrial revolution, learning how to optimize production and innovate, Spain was busy deskilling its entire population. They became a nation of middlemen and bureaucrats, people who knew how to move papers and count coins but had no idea how to build a ship or forge a plow. If a machine broke, they did not fix it. They just bought a new one from a German engineer and paid for it with a bag of Bolivian silver. This total reliance on foreign expertise meant that the wealth they earned from the mines was immediately flowing out of the country to pay for the skills they had allowed to atrophy. They were the classic lottery winners who fire their mechanic and their gardener, only to realize years later that they do not even know how to check the oil in the luxury cars they've accumulated. The silver was making their neighbors smarter and more productive, while it turned the Spanish people into a collection of entitled shadows who had forgotten the basic mechanics of survival. By the time the crown realized that their warehouses were full of silver but their workshops were empty, it was already too late to restart the engine of the economy. This hollow prosperity was a perfect setup for a disaster, because when the silver eventually slowed down, Spain would find itself in a world where it had plenty of money, but absolutely nothing to sell. Money is a lie we all agree to believe in. But in 16th century Spain, the lie became so big that it started starving the very people who held the silver. Most people assume that having more money makes a society richer, but money is actually just a claim check on the things people produce like grain, wool, or tools. When the Spanish crown started dumping thousands of tons of silver into Seville every year, they were not increasing the number of loaves of bread or the number of houses available for rent. They were just increasing the number of silver coins competing for that same limited supply of stuff. This is the basic math of a disaster where the value of the currency drops because the supply of that currency has outstripped the actual productivity of the nation. A merchant in 1560 Seville did not see the silver fleet and think about the glory of the empire. He saw a wave of new money about to hit the market and immediately doubled the price of his wheat because he knew his customers had more coins in their pockets. This created a vicious cycle where the very people who were supposed to be the wealthiest on earth found themselves unable to afford the basic necessities of life because the silver inflation was moving faster than their ability to earn a living. The Spanish economy became a place where you could be a millionaire in silver and still go to bed hungry, because the price of an egg had risen 10 times faster than your wages. The price revolution was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, grinding realization that the silver was actually a form of economic arson. As the silver filtered down from the crown to the soldiers, the bureaucrats, and the aristocrats, it created a massive surge in demand for luxury goods and basic commodities alike. However, because Spain had already started neglecting its own farms and workshops in favor of just buying things from abroad, there was no domestic supply to meet this demand. When you have too much money and not enough goods, the only thing that can happen is for prices to climb until they reach a breaking point. This was a catastrophe for the Spanish peasantry and the urban poor, whose income was often fixed by tradition or medieval guild rules that did not account for a mountain of silver falling on their heads. While the king was busy counting his bullion, the average Spaniard was watching the purchasing power of his life savings evaporate into the thin air of the Castilian plateau. This was not just a local problem. The inflation was so aggressive that Spanish-produced goods became the most expensive in Europe, which meant that no one in their right mind would buy a Spanish-made coat or a Spanish-forged sword. The silver was effectively subsidizing the industries of Spain's rivals in France, England, and the Netherlands, as Spanish consumers used their wealth to buy cheaper, better-made foreign products. By the middle of the century, The economic environment in Spain had become a hall of mirrors where nothing was what it seemed. The high price of labor in Spain, driven up by the cost of living, meant that it was impossible for a Spanish entrepreneur to start a business and turn a profit. Why would you hire a Spanish weaver who needs 5 silver coins a day just to buy bread when you can buy the same cloth from a Flemish weaver who only needs 2? This created a permanent trade deficit where the silver acted as a giant vacuum, sucking wealth out of the Spanish colonies, dragging it through the Spanish ports, and then immediately blowing it out to the rest of Europe. The Spanish people were essentially acting as a global courier service for a currency that they could not afford to keep for themselves. This disparity created a new poor, a class of people who had once been stable members of the middle class, but were now being crushed by the rising cost of existence. They were surrounded by the symbols of immense wealth, great cathedrals, massive palaces, and fleets of gold, but they were living in a state of perpetual financial insecurity. The silver had turned the Spanish economy into a bloated, inefficient monster that could only survive as long as the next shipment of bullion arrived to pay the inflated bills. This dependency was a trap that ensured that any hiccup in the silver supply would lead to a total systemic collapse. The most expensive thing in the world is money you have not earned yet, and the Spanish king was the world's first credit card addict. Even with the staggering volume of silver coming out of Potosi, the Spanish crown was perpetually broke because their ambitions were always larger than their bank account. Philip II was trying to run a global empire, fight the Ottoman Turks in the Mediterranean, suppress a massive rebellion in the Netherlands, and fund a fleet to invade England, all at the same time. The silver from a new world was impressive, but it was also predictable and slow, arriving only once or twice a year in a vulnerable fleet of ships. To bridge the gap between his massive military expenses and the arrival of the silver, the king turned to the only people who actually understood how money worked: the Genoese and German bankers. These financiers, like the legendary Fugger family, were more than happy to provide the king with short-term, high-interest loans known as asientos. These were essentially the 16th century version of a payday loan, allowing the king to spend his silver years before it was even dug out of the ground in Bolivia. The king was living on credit, and the interest rates were high enough to make a modern loan shark blush, often reaching 12 to 40%, depending on how desperate the crown was at that moment. The relationship between the Spanish crown and the international banking community was a toxic codependency that eventually crippled the empire's future. The bankers knew that the king was a bad bet, but they also knew that he was too big to fail because he controlled the world's only supply of silver. They would lend him the money to pay his mutinous soldiers in Flanders, and in exchange, they would receive a legal claim on the next 3 years of silver shipments before the ships even left the port of Portobello. This meant that when the silver fleet finally arrived in Seville, the crates of bullion were not going into the royal treasury. They were being hauled directly onto the ships of the Genoese bankers to pay off the interest on old debts. The Spanish Empire was effectively working for the banks, turning the most powerful nation on earth into a glorified collection agent for European financiers. This debt cycle was an inescapable whirlpool that forced the king to borrow more money just to pay the interest on the money he had already borrowed. The crown was constantly chasing its own tail, spending the wealth of the future to survive the crises of the present, with no plan for what would happen when the silver mines eventually started to run dry. This was a house of cards built on the assumption that the mountain of silver was a bottomless pit, an assumption that the bankers were happy to exploit as long as they could extract every possible ounce of profit. When the math finally stopped working, the Spanish crown did something that would become a recurring nightmare for the global economy. They simply stopped paying. In 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596, Philip II declared state bankruptcy, effectively wiping out his debts and ruining the bankers who had trusted him. But these were not bankruptcies in the modern sense where a company disappears. These were renegotiations where the king forced his creditors to accept long-term, low-interest government bonds called juros instead of the cold, hard silver he owed them. This was a massive rug pull that sent shockwaves through the European financial markets. But the king's addiction to credit was so strong that he would be back at the bargaining table with the same bankers just a few months later. The bankers kept lending because the potential rewards were too high to ignore, and the king kept borrowing because he had no other way to keep his empire from falling apart. This created a permanent state of financial instability where the Spanish government was technically insolvent while still being the most feared military power on the planet. The silver was no longer a source of strength. It was a collateral asset that was being used to delay an inevitable reckoning. Every time the king defaulted, he was burning a little more of his credibility and making the next loan even more expensive, ensuring that the empire's financial health was in a state of terminal decline. The tragedy of the Spanish debt was that it was entirely unproductive. They were not borrowing money to build infrastructure or stimulate trade, but to burn it in the fires of religious and territorial wars. Every coin spent on a cannon or a mercenary was a coin that was not being invested in the Spanish people or the Spanish economy. The bankers were the real winners of the Spanish Golden Age, as they effectively taxed the empire through interest rates and financial fees, siphoning off the wealth of the New World before it could ever benefit the citizens of Spain. This created a hollowed-out superpower, a nation that looked magnificent on a map, but was rotting from the inside out due to a total lack of fiscal discipline. The king's credit card was a tool of self-destruction that allowed him to ignore the reality of his failing economy for decades longer than he should have been able to. By the time the 16th century was drawing to a close, the Spanish crown was a shell of its former self, trapped in a loop of borrowing, spending, and defaulting that had no exit strategy. The Silver Mountain had become a curse, providing just enough wealth to keep the creditors at the door, but never enough to actually buy the empire's freedom. This massive debt was the hidden weight that would eventually pull the Spanish galleon under the waves, proving that even a mountain of silver say not save you if you've already spent the next 100 years of your income. The empire was now a prisoner of its own past decisions, waiting for a final collapse that was being subsidized by the very silver they thought would make them immortal. Silver is like water. It always finds the lowest point, and in the 16th century, the lowest point was anywhere but Spain. The Spanish crown spent decades trying to build a wall around its bullion, passing draconian laws that made exporting silver a capital offense. Yet the metal leaked out of the country as if the borders were made of chicken wire. This was not a failure of policing, but a failure of basic mathematics, as the Spanish economy had become a giant, leaking sieve that existed only to move wealth from the mountains of the New World to the markets of the East. The most significant drain on this wealth was the China's sink, a massive trade imbalance facilitated by the Manila Galleons that sailed across the Pacific to trade silver for luxury goods. At the time, the Ming Dynasty was undergoing a radical monetary shift called the Single Whip Reform, which mandated that all taxes be paid in silver, creating an insatiable demand for the metal in a country that had very little of its own. While Spain viewed silver as a way to pay for wars and palaces, China viewed it as the essential lubricant for its massive domestic economy, meaning that a single Spanish coin was worth twice as much in Canton as it was in Madrid. This price difference created a global arbitrage opportunity that no amount of Spanish legislation could stop, as merchants risked everything to smuggle silver out of the empire and into the hands of Chinese silk and porcelain traders. The logistics of this global leak were a masterpiece of unintended consequences, creating a circuit of wealth that effectively bypassed the Spanish taxpayer and enriched everyone else. A silver coin would be mined by an enslaved laborer in the freezing heights of Potosi, carried by llama to the coast of Peru, and then shipped to Acapulco, where it was loaded onto a galleon destined for the Philippines. Once in Manila, that coin was traded to Chinese merchants for high-end commodities that the Spanish elite craved, such as silk, spices, and fine ceramics, which were then shipped back to the Americas and eventually to Europe. This trade was a catastrophic exchange of capital for consumables. Spain was trading a permanent, non-renewable resource for items that would eventually wear out, break, or be eaten. By the time those luxury goods reached the aristocrats in Seville, the silver that paid for them was already deep inside the Chinese interior, never to return to the Western economy. This great leak meant that the Spanish Empire was essentially a giant extraction machine working on behalf of the Ming dynasty, providing the raw materials for Chinese economic stability while receiving nothing but decorative trinkets in return. The crown tried to limit this trade to 1 or 2 ships a year, but the corruption was so systemic that the actual volume of silver leaving the empire was likely 3 or 4 times the official limit, as every official from the governor to the dockworker took their cut in the form of untaxed bullion. Perhaps the most bitter irony of this era was that Spanish silver became the primary funding source for the very enemies who were trying to burn the Spanish Empire to the ground. Because Spain had neglected its own industrial base, it was forced to buy its military supplies, everything from gunpowder and cannons to the timber for its ships, from foreign markets, often in the Netherlands or England. The Dutch, who were fighting a bloody 80-year war for independence against the Spanish crown, were more than happy to sell supplies to their oppressors as long as they were paid in silver. This meant that a Spanish king would borrow money from a Genoese banker, pay for a shipment of silver from Potosi to cover the debt, and that silver would then be used by the banker to pay a Dutch merchant for grain or weapons destined for the Spanish army. That same Dutch merchant would then use the silver to fund the rebel navy that was currently sinking Spanish galleons in the Atlantic. The silver was a global currency that did not care about national loyalty or religious ideology. It simply flowed toward the most efficient producers, and in the 16th century, those producers were the Protestant rivals of the Catholic Spanish state. Spain was trapped in a cycle where it was literally paying for its own defeat, providing the liquidity that allowed the rest of Europe to develop the very merchant fleets and banking systems that would eventually replace Spain as the masters of the world. The party does not end when the music stops. It ends when the host realizes he sold his house to pay for the drinks. By the early 17th century, the Spanish Empire was entering the final stages of a terminal hangover, as the easy wealth of the previous 100 years had left the nation with a hollowed-out economy and a toxic culture of entitlement. The silver mines of Potosi were finally beginning to show signs of exhaustion, and the cost of extracting the remaining ore had skyrocketed because the easy-to-reach veins were gone. To keep the silver flowing, the Spanish had relied on the mita system, a form of forced labor that consumed the lives of millions of indigenous people. But even this horrific human sacrifice could not compensate for the declining quality of the ore. Furthermore, the mercury required for the refining process, which was sourced from the deadly mines of Huancavelica, had poisoned the surrounding environment and the workforce to such an extent that the entire production chain was collapsing under its own weight. Spain had built a global superpower on the assumption that the earth would never stop bleeding silver, and as the flow turned into a trickle, the empire found itself with no backup plan and no way to pay its bills. The resource curse had reached its logical conclusion. A nation that had everything for free now had nothing, because it had forgotten how to produce value through its own effort. This economic collapse was mirrored by a psychological rot that had settled deep into the Spanish soul, particularly among the nobility who viewed labor as a mark of shame. The Hidalgo mindset, which prioritized bloodline and honor over productivity and innovation, had become a national disease that prevented the country from adapting to the new reality of the 17th century. Even as the empire teetered on the edge of bankruptcy, the Spanish elite continued to spend fortunes on elaborate religious festivals and massive palaces, convinced that their status as the chosen people of God would somehow protect them from the laws of supply and demand. This refusal to engage with the reality of trade and industry meant that Spain was becoming a ghost of an empire, a vast territory that looked impressive on a map but was functionally insolvent. While the Dutch were developing the joint stock company and the English were refining their maritime laws to encourage commerce, the Spanish were still arguing over aristocratic titles and the purity of their bloodlines. The silver had acted as a drug that masked the pain of their decline, allowing them to ignore the fact that their neighbors were passing them by in every measurable category of national strength. When the silver finally ran out, the Spanish people woke up to find themselves in a country with no factories, no middle class, and a government that was more interested in maintaining the illusion of power than the reality of it. The final ledger of the Spanish Silver Age is a forensic study in how a society can be destroyed by its own luck. By the time the 17th century was half over, Spain had fallen from the most powerful nation in the world to a second-rate power, a bankrupt shell that was being carved up by its more industrious neighbors. The silver trap had functioned perfectly. It provided enough wealth to encourage a century of reckless overexpansion and military aggression, but it never provided enough to build a sustainable economy that could survive without the mines. The environmental and human cost was staggering, leaving behind a legacy of poisoned land and broken societies in the Americas, while the mother country was left with a legacy of permanent debt and industrial stagnation. Wealth is not a pile of shiny rocks hidden in a mountain, and it is not a fleet of ships filled with bullion. Wealth is the collective skill, ingenuity, and productivity of a people who know how to build something from nothing. Spain found a mountain of money and used it to buy a 150-year vacation from reality, only to find that when the vacation was over, they no longer had a home to return to. This is the ultimate lesson of the Potosi ATM. If you do not earn your wealth, you do not actually own it. You're just a temporary custodian of a currency that is already looking for a more productive place to live. The Spanish Empire did not lose its silver to pirates or storms. It lost its silver to the simple fact that it had nothing else to offer the world, proving that the only thing more dangerous than having no money is having too much of it.